Welcome to the Alta Group Podcasts on real estate. I'm your host, Tom Silva. Today our guest is author, activist, and social entrepreneur Amy Dean, a leader in the labor movement for more than 20 years. As head of the 15th largest regional labor federation in the country, the South Bay AFL-CIO Labor Council, Amy represented 90 unions and more than 110,000 workers. Her latest book is A New Deal: How Regional Activism Will Reshape the American Labor Movement. What I'd like to do is have you give us a brief description of the history of the labor movement. How did unions get started?
As long as there's been any form of commerce, capital organizing itself to perform any kind of function in the economy, there's always been working people coming together to assert their own interests. As people moved out of the agrarian society and as with the growth of industrialization and mass production, a huge wave of demographic change in America as people moved into the urban centers of America to take the jobs of growing industry, steel and auto, rubber, machinery. As people moved out of the agrarian parts of society and into the industrial parts of cities where industry was forming, there was a need for people to come together and to organize themselves, wages, benefits. These jobs in the industrial parts of the economy were not preordained to be high-paying, high-wage, high-benefited industries. They didn't become that until people organized. And the history is oftentimes not as romantic as people like to, sometimes recall. I mean, the emergence of unions in these industries came about through oftentimes physical violence. Capital's never been open-armed about the need for employees to organize. I think ultimately when you present capital with the choice between onerous public standards of employment, like we see in European countries, versus individualized organizations that form along industrial lines, which is what we have today in traditional unionization, and you give people the choice. It's public standards versus rights and responsibilities for groups to negotiate together on a local basis. Industry will take what they see as the lesser of evils, but there's never been open-armed acceptance.
And yet there was tremendous support for unions during the 19th century. I mean, the Catholic Church, Adam Smith, who many people credit with being the father of capitalism, was a huge supporter of the unions because he thought it was a necessary corrective to the ownership class.
Which is understandable. I mean, Adam Smith's whole acknowledgement that there needs to be some kind of countervailing force to the forces of capital to have civil society is what I think has allowed unions to survive over these years. But I think we began to depart from that in the 1980s, where we really did hit a political moment in America where that notion is just no longer held near and dear to our hearts. There is no belief any longer that we need countervailing forces to capital.
So the thing that might surprise people about unions is that between World War II and the 1970s, relatively recently, there was really consensus on both the right and the left about unions. Eisenhower, a Republican, acknowledged the impact of unions and said that the economic interests of employers and employees are about mutual prosperity. So the question is, why did both Democrats and Republicans support unions going into the 1970s?
We had a different economy back then. In the post-World War II economy, we had an economy that had insulated borders. We insulated industries. We believed that it was important for us to build up our industrial base, that we were in a position where we wanted to create economic prosperity so that we began to rebuild an enfranchised class that would rebuild our country post-World War II. There was a lot of there were social factors going on at the time as well. I mean, not only did we have an economy with insulated borders, industry that realized we needed to create a consumer class if they were going to sell those products within our borders, but our notions of social justice were very different then than they are today. We were a much more homogenous society. We had much more sense of common purpose, if you will, than we have today, where we're an incredibly fractured ideological society. And so the combination of our trade, the way we constituted trade, the need for industry to have a consumer class. In other words, it was a time in history where you could say what's good for GM is good for America. because there was a mutual benefit.
So let's talk a little bit about the 1970s and the 80s. I think the two seismic events that people talk about in terms of changing the way labor relations operated were Ronald Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers in 1981, and also Margaret Thatcher in England ending closed union shops and the miners' strike. So give us a sense of what was going on during that period.
Toward the 1970s, with the breakdown of insulated borders and as economies started to integrate themselves, as industries started to integrate themselves, it wasn't wholesale economies. With the beginning of steel and textile and apparel, as these industries began to negotiate bilateral trade agreements with other countries along the world, and as we started having our domestic markets cut into, there was increasing pressure to lower cost of doing business. And the one thing that you can take on is your employees. That's the easiest thing to go after. It's the one thing, fixed costs are fixed costs, but you can go after human capital. And so the consensus began to break down at the middle of 1970s, and from that point on till today, we have no consensus about the way in which our economy should grow, what our obligations are to one another, and how best to compete under these conditions. I think we're in a big conundrum now in America. How on the one hand are we competitive, and on the other hand create economic enfranchisement for our people so that we can maintain civil society here in America and across the world.
So, Amy, what would you say to the corporate skeptic who says that the three greatest periods of growth in the American economy were the Gilded Age right after the Civil War, the 20s, and then really the 80s and 90s, when you saw a reduction in the power of the unions and deregulation? So how would you answer somebody who says that it's exactly the reason that we were able to grow in the way that we did?
Well, I can tell you after spending 17 years in the Silicon Valley that we should look at that because that's sort of the epicenter of the environment that you described. And what we saw happen in the Silicon Valley between 1980 and today, we saw the economy go through multiple revolutions. We went from a semiconductor industry to now what is almost exclusively a software and internet industry. And at the time that the economy was growing, and yet you looked at what was happening among jobs, you take the heart of all of that, the 1990s, that 6 of the 10 fastest growing occupations in the heart of Silicon Valley paid less than $10 an hour. And that the remaining jobs, the 4 out of 10, required a bachelor's degree and a few hours of on-the-job training. So you look at those numbers and you say to yourself, yes, here we are in the middle of a boom and we're creating enormous amount of employment, lowest levels of unemployment since World War I, and yet the qualitative nature of that employment is not allowing people to sustain a decent standard of living. People increasingly are working in jobs that pay $10 an hour or less, no benefits, part-time employment, contract employment, leased employment. The employment relationship began to change dramatically based on the needs of industry. And as a result, while unemployment was low, we saw growing numbers of temporary and part-time employment, something sort of what we called the shock absorbers in the ultimately flexible economy. So I think that what happened in large part in the 1990s and what continues to take place today is that the traditional economic measures of success that we use to determine how is our economy doing, how is industry doing, really no longer bear relationship to the success of communities and families and their well-being. So we once were able to say what's good for GM is good for our country because we had a linkage between economic prosperity and well-being and collective bargaining. Increasingly, industry can post record-breaking quarterly earnings and it have no relationship to employment in the region, no relationship to tax base in the region. And so as a result, you really can't argue anymore that what's good for Intel is good for America because it may be that those economic indicators have nothing to do with what's happening in the community in which they live. And so what is truly at one time in America a huge growth period in the end left more disparity between enfranchised classes of people and who's at the bottom today.
So let's talk about how the unions are going to adapt to the new world. I think you'll agree they can't go back to where they were. So what does the new union look like, and what concessions do they have to make in order to still be viable?
I think the next generation of employee organizations will look sort of like a crossroads between the occupational unions of the past, and the professional associations that are growing today. Performing a function where you're setting wages, and you're setting standards for healthcare and pensions, but we'll do it differently. If you look at places like, or industries like the building trades, the entertainment industry, these are good models to look to for what I believe the next generation of employee organization will look like. Where you go from job to job, you have a base wage, and built into that base wage are costs for healthcare and pension. And essentially, I have a traveling, mobile pension and healthcare plan that's enabled by my union that serves as the technically employer of record. Now, because our labor laws are so outdated and were written at a time when America was transforming into an industrial era, we don't even have the legal infrastructure to allow for that kind of change. When I lived in the Silicon Valley, I always made it a point to be friends with industry leaders, always because it was important to understand what was on their minds. And so had very interesting conversations with people like Eric Benhamou, who at the time was heading up 3Com, Bob Saldich, who at the time was heading up Raytheon, and I would have conversations with them, and I would say, what would you rather have? A set of unpredictable conditions wherever you went in the world about the cost of labor? Or would you rather have predictability? And on every single one of these occasions, John Chambers, every single one of these occasions, these folks would say, any day of the week, build in or bake into the cost of labor all these extras, so long as it's predictable for me. So long as I'm not wondering every time I go into a separate market what's going to be my situation with respect to labor. Because anybody knows, whether you're in the building trades, the entertainment industry, or whatever industry you're in, core to your success is trying to create as much predictability in this incredibly volatile environment. And so I don't believe that employers are inherently bad people. I believe that economics and the infrastructure in which we are forced to operate, which by law is not, by the way, is not governed by physical laws of nature. The economy is formed by personal human values and politics. And I believe that we can, once again, connect economic decision-making to values, and at the same time enter into a new social contract, again, between employees, labor, and the government to create standards around employment.